Welcome back to another North Carolina Tar Heels football recruiting podcast here on TarHeelIllustrated.com. And if you are watching us on our YouTube channel, that is called Tar Heel Illustrated. And don't forget, you can follow us on Twitter at Heel Illustrated, not Heels, at Heel Illustrated. You can also follow us on Facebook, Tar Heel Illustrated. I'm THI publisher Andrew Jones, and joining me is our director of football recruiting, Miss Deana King, and we are here to discuss a topic of significant interest to a lot of fans that they have picked up on this recently, and it's something that Deana has talked about for a while, and she kind of triggered several months ago that recruiting was going to head in this direction, and that's the changing footprint for UNC football recruiting. Originally, when Mack Brown was hired, and he'll still say this now, that the footprint is from south of Metro Atlanta to the Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia, but certainly the Maryland suburbs in Washington, D.C. That is still part of the footprint, but it has expanded. And there's some reasons why it's expanded. It's gone heavily west toward Nashville and in the Nashville area, and we have seen more activity in recruiting in southern Florida, in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area as well, which is an area they didn't really recruit for a while. Larry Fedora used to go after that area pretty hard, and the current staff is back there now. In fact, they recently got a commitment from Hollywood, Florida, which is in the Miami, I think it's in Dade County. So, Deana, let's discuss the changing footprint. I would say maybe the first area I want to go with this is the whole Tennessee side of things. I think that's interesting. They have recruited Eastern Tennessee some before. They got Eli Sutton a couple of years ago from Tennessee, but it's like every 4 or 5 offers that we're putting into our offer thread is from Tennessee, kids from Nashville area. So what are your thoughts about the whole Tennessee thing in North Carolina?
Well, a lot of Carolina fans would be like, well, University of Tennessee, they come to North Carolina a lot of times and try to steal their players from the Tar Heel State up to Knoxville. So I guess it's a little bit of fair play. The Tar Heels going to the Volunteer State and trying to get some of the Tennessee guys to come to Chapel Hill. I've been to Nashville. It's not that far from where I live, probably about 6 hours, 7-hour trip. So, and it's a couple hours maybe to Chapel Hill. So not that far. And you said before, they've recruited, they got Eli Sutton out of that Nashville area. And I think it's just the type of kid that Coach Brown and the staff are recruiting. A lot of kids in that Nashville area. You have Vanderbilt, who is one of the top academic universities, and a lot of those kids have Vanderbilt in their top list. So it's just something that I've noticed here recently, that North Carolina have been going after some of these kids.
We may have to enlist David Sisk to go do some football recruiting for us, since he's in that area.
Yeah. I've did some basketball stuff for him in this state, so David might have to go to some football games.
Football. Can you imagine David at a football camp? That'd be
sounds like a football coach.
He does. Well,
he's got that same accent that I have. So.
I like the move into Tennessee, because Tennessee's a growing state, big time, and there are a lot of players there, and Tennessee can't take them all. You know what you always say about Georgia? Georgia can't take them all. Well, Tennessee can't take them all either, and a lot of those kids might not be as interested in Tennessee. And one of the things we're going to get into later about the academic element of this, which I think is very, very interesting. And a lot of the kids in Tennessee are in private schools, and there is an academic element with a lot of those kids. Let's move on to the Georgia, which Georgia is a strong part of the footprint, Deana, and it always has been. But it's almost like there's more activity in Georgia, a higher concentration of the kids that they're looking at are in Georgia now than ever before. And one could say that North Carolina is their number one state of priority. Georgia is their number two state of priority. It's now surpassed Virginia in that element.
Yeah, I agree. Georgia technically borders North Carolina, so it is a border state. So, I've been up in that part of North Carolina, Smoky Mountain Conference, in my high school football job and everything. But yes, Georgia, like you said, outside of North Carolina, it is the main recruiting state that the Tar Heels are focusing on. So much talent down there, and I did the piece earlier this year. The offers, I mean, Georgia, a lot of Georgia might have more Georgia kids might have more offers than the in-state kids. I mean, Georgia is by far the most talented state. They're like that basically every year. So North Carolina has a strong foothold in Georgia. A lot of great Georgia players have come to North Carolina and played. I mean, in the past, I mean, there's been several, and right now, Kamen Rucker, Will Hardy, are a couple of Georgia guys that have really looking to have great careers at North Carolina. So Atlanta is a big Tar Heel alumni center. So a lot of kids they know who North Carolina is. Big metropolis there, and so is in like Nashville. Atlanta is not that far from Chapel Hill, considering some places all on the map. So
yeah,
a lot of Georgia kids are like geographical with North Carolina. A lot of those kids,
it's because it's not too far.
Yeah, and
And,
they have
one
a
of the
great
things
brand of
also,
high school football down there. So I mean, there's
well, that's
so
what I
many
wanted to ask you
kids.
about. That's what I wanted to ask you about, because the whole, well, Georgia can't take everybody, which is absolutely 100% true. One of the things that I know that the staff likes, I know for a fact that the staff likes about a lot of the kids in Georgia, and you've talked about this before. In fact, you're the first person I heard bring this up, and that's why I brought it up to somebody on the staff here recently, is that a lot of the three-star kids in Georgia might be ranked three stars because they're being judged against all these fours and fives in the state, right? And if you take that same kid and put him in even Virginia and North Carolina, which always produce a lot of talent, they might be four stars because they would stand out a little bit differently. A lot of them have chips on their shoulders because they're really good, but they're in such a talent-heavy state, they get kind of overlooked. Rucker and Hardy are classic examples. Elijah Green won 3 state championships, and he was a three-star. And everybody saw his talent last year. And the staff loves those kinds of kids because sometimes you bring in a 4 or a 5, and there's a little bit of entitlement factor there. Maybe it takes them a little longer to kind of get the proper mojo going to be a college football player. A lot of the three step in. In fact, you brought up Rucker and Hardy as an example. Rucker showed up in the summer, his freshman year, and he played the most snaps of any freshman the first game against Syracuse that year. Hardy shows up in the summer last year, and I remember talking to kids after the 4th practice, who's standing out? They're all saying Will Hardy. He was a 3-star kid who should have been a 4. And the staff doesn't look at star ratings. They just look at the kids, but they also know. They know what the star ratings are because they know that there's often going to be an edge with those threes in Georgia. And I think that's what's really interesting about the recruiting process here. It's not just Georgia has a ton of talent. It's that Georgia's 3 stars have a big time edge to them.
And that goes back to high school football in Georgia. I mean, they play some really good, and for the most part in the South, I mean, high school football is king. You know how it is in Texas. facilities. You know, I think one of the reasons, like in North Carolina's case, I'm veering back to North Carolina, is when the Panthers got here in the NFL, and when the guys from the NFL decide to retire, they've made their homes here in Charlotte and out in the outlying areas, and they stay there. And most of the guys, when they go into mentoring and training and everything, and I think that's one reason the Charlotte area has really grown talent wise, is because with the Panthers coming to town and their guys staying around, helping out any way they can to help the high school kids and everything.
Yeah.
And the same thing could be said in Atlanta and different areas of Atlanta. That the outskirts of Atlanta is just filled with the players. I mean, I'm getting used to a lot of those Georgia high schools like Mill Creek and places like that, covering recruiting for in the Georgia area. So a lot of high schools, and it's farther down into Savannah and everything. So Georgia's a big state, and they've got a lot of talent, and North Carolina's going to take advantage of it because, like I said, a lot of the Georgia kids are, like you mentioned, the kids that are like the 3 stars are hard workers, and they're out to
Yeah.
prove that, hey, and that's funny thing that sometimes you see on social media, these kids that are 4 and 5 stars and be at an event, and a kid that maybe not ranked, or a 2 star or 3 star is like, hey, look what I did against the 4 and 5 star.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe you should be kind of higher up, maybe them not
Yeah.
as high. So it's a lot of subjective opinion and everything.
In my recent conversation with a coach of the North Carolina staff about this, he said another thing that really helps Georgia high school football is A, they have a spring practice, a very good one, and B, he said the coaching is phenomenal in the state. And the third thing is there's just tremendous interest, so it's really important. I'll give you a side note here. Bruce Young, our former photographer, Brett Friedlander, who's at Saturday Road, a good friend here at THI, and we're both personal friends. We drove, instead of flying, I went ahead and drove to Tallahassee, the 2016 game. Remember the Nick Weiler field goal game? And the night before, we actually stayed in Valdosta, Georgia, and we went to a high school football game. Video boards, everything, right there. It was Valdosta against a school from a small town, but it wasn't a small time team at all. Well, we were looking up the rosters and looking up kids' names that stood out. And we discovered, just doing it on our phones, watching the game, that there were like 7 3-stars and 3 or 4 4-star kids playing in the game. And there were about 14,000 people there. And it was like a small SEC environment. Mm-hmm. And I just think that things like that, it matters. I think there's just a lot more put into it. The communities get around it big time. So the infrastructure is really solid. Everything they need that they have, from the weight facilities, and they have, strength and conditioning, and they have multiple assistant coaches, more than what, maybe your Panther Creek High School might have here in the Raleigh area. So that's another part of it. So when colleges get kids like that, they're getting a lot of kids who maybe might not have that extra skip in their step that some of the 4s and 5s have, but man, they're pretty polished when they show up. Again, I go back to Hardy and Rucker as perfect examples.
Yeah.
Well, also Virginia still matters, Deana. But we're looking more at Richmond. We're looking more at Northern Virginia. I know that the 757 was vitally important to North Carolina. They have a lot of guys from the 757 on the roster. The Dre Bly factor, I don't think is as significant as some people have made it out to be, because Lonnie Galloway, and this also comes from a coach on the staff, Lonnie Galloway is the one who really gets the credit for George Pettaway, for Andre Green, and for Zach Rice. He gets more credit for that than Dre did. And I'm not dumping on Dre here at all. It's just what I was told. Dre obviously was very important, but North Carolina was an important school for kids in the 757 before Dre was on the staff, and will always be that way. But they're recruiting the whole state pretty hard, and there's a lot of talent outside the 757. I grew up in Northern Virginia, ton of talent up there. There's like 50 public schools up there and all these really good private schools, and they're hitting the other side of DC as well over there in Maryland. And then Richmond's an area that is just growing and growing and growing, and there's a lot of talent, and they're hitting that area pretty hard as well in recruiting.
Yeah, Virginia's a big state as well, and Coach Tommy Thigpen, I know he's got a lot down in the kind of the Charlotte area, but he's also big in Virginia. He's recruited some really good defensive players up there in Virginia, and from Northern Virginia, the DC area down through Richmond.
Well, let me jump in. Let me jump in.
He's from that area.
Yeah, his last couple of years in high school, he played in what back then we considered the southern point of Metro DC, which now Metro DC basically extends to Fredericksburg. Mm-hmm. But then it was the Potomac Mills area, the Dumfries area, which is south of where I grew up. And there's always been talent there for all sports. David Robinson's from that area. Carolina's had a bunch of dudes from that area before. Kendall Marshall's from that area, by the way, in basketball. A lot of football players from that area as well. So I just want to interject a Thigpen connection to that area.
Yeah, Virginia is always going to be in the North Carolina recruiting. I mean, some of the best players ever to wear the Carolina jersey are from Virginia. So, I mean, it's just North Carolina is going to recruit North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia and South Carolina. Mac has basically said that was their core footprint. But then they're gonna go after the best player possible in case there's some maybe there's always sometimes that a state may not have as many prospects that they're interested in, so they have to make up for it somewhere else. Like we've seen that.
Let's head to South Florida, where the program is kind of intermittently intertwined itself into South Florida over the years. Mac didn't hit it hard when he first came back. I wouldn't say they're hitting it hard right now, but they have a presence now in South Florida, far more presence than they had for a few years. In fact, they recently got a 4-star commitment from South Florida. So why have they gone further south? Is it because people on the staff have connections there? Or is it just them kind of spreading the net to find the right kids that they're looking for? Because they have changed a little bit in identifying what exactly they want, what kind of kids they want to bring into the program. Is that the reason why?
I think it's maybe a combination of both. I don't know, Jason Jones, what areas he recruited when he was, at other places. But, like I said in that piece I did earlier about the offers, I mean, Florida was right behind North Carolina and Georgia and up there with Tennessee. Those four states had the most offers that North Carolina had issued out since the first of the year. So Florida is they're right there, top talent in all parts of the state. And, there's really big clusters down there in South Florida and three, well, and if you include Central Florida, four really good places that these kids can go to because they have the talent that the whole roster could be Florida kids. So,
yeah.
You mentioned getting the running back at a very, very big school that's known for putting a lot of kids in Power Five. I think their quarterback just committed to NC State, so the Wolfpack is going down in that part of the
Yeah.
Florida as well. So you got to go where the players are, and the Miami area, Southern Florida has a lot of great. Jacksonville also has a great
Yeah.
bunch of kids.
Larry Fedora's staff hit Jacksonville hard. Like their net was south of Jacksonville, but then they went into Orlando to get like Nolan DeFranco, and they went to Tampa to get Day Hollins, and they hit some of those other areas because there are so many kids down there, and they did go into South Florida a little bit more than Mac did initially. But I do think it's interesting, and I want to kind of cap this podcast off with one of the reasons I think that they've spread their net, Deana, is because they're targeting there are a few they're targeting, I want to say, a different kind of kid. I think that would be fair. Just they're looking for something different in some of these kids. I think with the transfer portal being so chaotic, Mac wants to bring in as many kids as possible that are going to be in college for a variety of reasons. And because of that, they're less likely to leave. Because roster management, the Carolina basketball fans listening to this, think about how their head's spinning right now with roster management for basketball. All right. With what Hubert's going to have to deal with here in the next couple of weeks. Imagine having that with a roster of 85 scholarship kids. And then the limitations and how many you can hand out per year and all that kind of stuff. The cascading reality of that. So if you could bring in kids that are going to help your program and they could provide the foundation. I like to talk about skylines. A great skyline isn't just the tallest buildings. It's the filler. And if you can get a lot of your program filler by getting kids that are just not going to leave, they're there for other reasons as well. I think that's part of the shift in the recruiting focus here. Not saying they're going after kids that are great, just saying that they're trying to identify kids with maybe broader spectrum of priorities as well. And I think they also might think that a lot of those kids are a little bit more coachable because they have a little more realistic vision about their place in that program at that time, which isn't always the case these days, especially now since everyone is told that they're the greatest ever. And then they show up to college and they're sitting on the bench. They have no idea how to handle it. And then they leave. So I think that's part of what they're doing here. And as a result, you're seeing a lot more kids that Carolina's offering now to have offers from the smart schools, the Vandy's, the Dukes, and so on, even some recently with Ivy League offers and the service academies.
Yeah. And in talking to these kids, they had a big recruiting weekend, the weekend, the home game against Duke. A lot of those guys, they talked about, when I asked them what were some of the best parts of the trip, and even some of them said the getting to see the academic side of the school, and they mentioned stuff like that. I mean, and that's a North Carolina has a great a great academic university that has a lot of different majors and stuff, and they use that. If a lot of kids, they realize, basically all football players, their goal and dreams are sometimes to make the NFL, but the NFL had a former all-pro cornerback tell me that he's like, NFL stands for not for long, and they need to be prepared for what's after football. And a lot of them think that getting a degree and an education from North Carolina is outstanding, could help them, and the networking. So that is a very big positive North Carolina has and has used. Mac has said that 40 year decision, and it's true. Look how many guys have come back in that program to actually work inside the
Yeah.
Keenan Football Center.
Yeah.
And they help each other out. And I just, you know, when doing these offers, when we post offers and when we post the recruiting articles, we always like to mention the other schools that have offered the kid, because it kind of gives you a good idea. Like, well, if this guy's got a, you know, Alabama and Clemson and Georgia and Florida and Ohio State and Notre Dame, you know, he's a big time player. Just, you know, he probably a 4 or 5 star. But then you get a kid that has, you know, Boston College, Vanderbilt, Wake Forest, Duke, Michigan. I've seen a lot of kids have Michigan, because Michigan is a
Very good
top
school. It's
academic
a lot like
university too.
Carolina. It's the
And then
Carolina of
have
the Midwest. Yeah.
and then have the Army and Navy and stuff like that. You kind of like, well, this kid is looking at, you know, the total package, the
Yeah.
academics and the athletics, and Stanford. I mentioned Stanford. There's been some kids mention Stanford in that
Yeah.
group too. So,
Well, one of the things that has also been communicated to some of these kids too is that unless you become a star in the NFL, you don't make life-changing money in the NFL. If you get a second contract in the NBA, you can make life-changing money. If you get into Major League Baseball and you get a second contract, you're making life-changing money. In the NFL, you're not making life-changing money, in part because nothing's guaranteed, right?
yeah.
So you make good money in that little moment in time, but it's not life-changing money. So they have to really look at the other things. So when you walk through the Keenan Football Center, as I do during the season multiple times a week, you see a lot of stuff in there about pushing the academic side and what people have done after football, not just all the guys in the pros, but you see a lot of the other stuff in there too. And I think that if you're UNC, you have to use that to your advantage, because you're not going to go do the pick of the litter thing like Alabama does. You're not going to do that like Georgia does. You kind of have to be a little bit more creative. It's not UNC basketball where you basically have the pick of the litter. You have to be more creative. And I think it's fascinating watching the staff, especially under Mac's guidance, as he gets one more year into this each year, how he's changed some of these things, because he's learning on the fly. And it is another example, and this is another podcast for their time, but Mac definitely adjusts. He changes with the time and he adjusts, and he has no problem saying, you know what, that wasn't working. Let's scrap it and let's try this. and you see it with the recruiting trail as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he had some really, really top notch, and now, you know,
A lot of
he's
them are gone.
come down a little bit, and, you know, they have to get in the Keenan Football Center and regroup. And
I will add this, Deana. If they win big and a lot of 4s and 5s want to come, he's going to take them.
oh yeah, yeah.
But they're in a situation right now where they have to be creative, and they have mapped this out. This is their plan. And I think it will remain their plan to a degree. But if they suddenly if they can land, 14 4s and 4 5s in each class, they're going to do it. All right. Because in the end, he's here to win. And the more talent you have, the more you win. But I should remind people that they don't really look at stars. They give their own evaluation. But the reason the star thing's important, they know that a kid that's really talented, but is a 3, like I was saying earlier about the Georgia kids, and they're kind of under the radar, they're usually almost always going to have a chip, and they want kids with a chip, because you can't coach a chip. A chip is there, man. And you love dudes with a chip. And I think sometimes the last couple of years, they've had some guys in the field that didn't have a chip, and they want more that do. They'll take a 3 with a chip than a 4 with no chip every day of the week. Most coaches ultimately will, as it is. She's Deana King. I'm Andrew Jones. We appreciate you stopping by.